There was a time, not so long ago, when a man wouldn't dream of walking to the corner store without a jacket on. Not because anyone forced him to. Not because there was a rule posted on the wall. He did it because somewhere along the way, America decided that showing up looking sharp was a form of respect. Respect for the day, respect for the people you'd meet, respect for the simple idea that life was worth greeting properly. Picture a Saturday morning in 1954. A man steps out onto his porch in a charcoal gray suit, not for a wedding, not for church, just to walk 2 blocks and buy a newspaper and a pack of cigarettes. His neighbor, mowing the lawn in a collared shirt and slacks, tips his hat as he passes. Nobody thinks twice about it. This was simply how men dressed. Today, we'd call that overdressed. Back then, they called it Tuesday. So how did an entire generation of American men end up wearing wool suits and felt hats every single day, rain or shine, work or play, and how did that whole way of living quietly disappear in less than 2 decades? That's the story we're getting into today. To understand why the suit became sacred, you have to go back to where these men had just come from. The generation that built the 1950s hadn't had an easy road to get there. They'd grown up during the Great Depression, watching their fathers lose jobs, watching families stretch a single dollar until it screamed. Clothing back then wasn't a form of self-expression. It was often a patch job, a hand-me-down, a source of quiet shame if it was too worn or too small. Then came the war. An entire generation of young men traded whatever clothes they owned for uniforms, and spent years learning that presentation mattered, that a pressed collar and a clean shave were sometimes the only dignity a soldier had left to hold on to. When they finally came home, something had shifted in how they saw clothing altogether. A suit wasn't just fabric anymore. It was proof. Proof that the hard years were over. Proof that a man had a steady paycheck, a stable home, a seat at the table of this new booming American economy. Dressing well became a quiet philosophy, almost a form of gratitude. You dressed up because you'd survived hardship, and because the world in front of you finally felt like it deserved the effort. And for the first time in American history, dressing that way was actually within reach for the ordinary guy. Through the 1940s, wartime rationing had limited how much fabric a suit could even use, which is actually why the suits of that decade had such lean, narrow cuts. But once the war ended and the economy roared to life, ready-to-wear clothing exploded onto the scene. Companies like Brooks Brothers and Sears realized they didn't need to serve only the wealthy anymore. A factory worker, a school teacher, an insurance salesman, all of them could now walk into a department store and walk out looking like they belonged on Wall Street. For around $45, a price that a working man could actually afford, you could own a suit that made you look like $1 million. This was revolutionary. Dressing sharp was no longer a privilege of the elite. It became, almost overnight, the uniform of the average American man. And it really was a uniform, in the most literal sense. Walk down any main street in 1955 and you'd see the same basic formula repeated on nearly every man you passed. The suit itself was almost always wool, cut in gray, charcoal, or navy, with broad, confident shoulders and a waist that tapered in just slightly, giving the whole silhouette a kind of quiet strength. This structured look borrowed heavily from Ivy League style, the kind of clean-cut tailoring you'd see on college campuses in the Northeast, and it trickled down into everyday American wardrobes until it became the default. Underneath the jacket, men wore shirts that were crisp almost to the point of being stiff, starched white or pale blue, buttoned all the way up. And then came the tie, which was really the one place a man got to have a little fun. Bold stripes, playful paisleys, geometric prints and colors that popped against the otherwise conservative suit. In a world where the jacket said conformity, the tie was where a man's personality was allowed to peek through. And we can't talk about this era without talking about the hat, because the hat wasn't some afterthought tossed on as men walked out the door. It was structural. It was the exclamation point at the end of the sentence. Fedoras with their creased crowns and snapped brims, Homburgs with their stiffer, more formal shape, pork-pies with their flat tops and short brims, these weren't just accessories, they were essential. A well-dressed man without a hat in 1955 would have felt half-finished, the way we might feel leaving the house without our phone today. And here's the thing that's easy to forget, this wasn't just a look for bankers and businessmen, this was a societal contract, shared across nearly every walk of life. The factory worker who spent his weekdays in coveralls would put on his good suit for church on Sunday. The mailman wore a version of this same structured look as part of his uniform. Fathers wore suits to take their kids to baseball games. Men wore suits to grocery stores. It wasn't about status. It was simply what a man wore when he stepped outside his front door and into the world. But like every great cultural uniform in American history, this one had an expiration date, and the moment that started the countdown arrived, somewhat unexpectedly, on a freezing January day in 1961. John F. Kennedy stood on the steps of the Capitol to be sworn in as president, and in the moments before his inaugural address, he removed his top hat. It seems like such a small gesture looking back, barely a footnote in the grand scope of that speech. But it landed like a thunderclap across the American hat industry. Kennedy was young, energetic, and impossibly charismatic, the kind of man other men wanted to imitate, and almost overnight, going hatless stopped looking careless and started looking modern. Through the early 1960s, hat sales collapsed. Manufacturers that had spent generations crafting fedoras and Homburgs watched their business evaporate within a few short years, all because the most photographed man in the country decided he liked the wind in his hair. But here's the twist, because while Kennedy accidentally killed the hat, he simultaneously ushered in what might be the golden age of the suit itself. Kennedy favored a slimmer, more tailored silhouette, often called the continental cut, with narrower lapels and a leaner overall shape that felt sharper and more youthful than the boxier suits of the previous decade. Suddenly, this new streamlined style became the look of ambition, of intelligence, of the young executive climbing the ladder in a gleaming Madison Avenue office. This is the exact era that later inspired shows built around advertising agencies and their sharply dressed, hard-drinking, deeply ambitious men. The suit hadn't disappeared. If anything, it had been refined, sharpened, given a new kind of cool. For a few more years, at least, the suit remained the undisputed symbol of American masculinity. But cultural shifts rarely stay contained, and by the mid to late 1960s, something much bigger was brewing beneath the surface of American life. The baby boomer generation, the sons of the men who had built the suburbs and worn the gray flannel suits, started looking at their fathers' wardrobes and seeing something different than pride. They saw conformity. They saw restriction. They saw a uniform that represented obedience to a system they were increasingly questioning, especially as the Vietnam War dragged on and trust in institutions began to crack. Dressing like your father started to feel less like an honor and more like surrender. And so, piece by piece, the old uniform began to unravel. Jeans, once considered strictly workwear for ranchers and laborers, crossed over into mainstream fashion and became a symbol of casual defiance. Turtlenecks started replacing ties, offering warmth and comfort without the formality. Straight-cut trousers gave way to wide, dramatic bell-bottoms that practically announced a break from the buttoned-up past. For a brief, wild stretch, even the traditional menswear brands that had built their reputations on somber grays and navies pivoted hard into bright colors and bold patterns, a moment fashion historians sometimes call the peacock revolution, where men suddenly felt free to dress with as much color and flair as anyone else. So did the suit die completely? Not exactly. It's still with us today, pulled out for interviews, weddings, funerals, big presentations. But what it lost, and lost for good, was its monopoly. For a couple of decades, the suit wasn't a choice, it was simply what a man wore, full stop, no negotiation. After the 60s, it became one option among many, competing with jeans and turtlenecks and eventually with the entire casual revolution that would define the decades to follow. What started as a quiet post-war philosophy about order and dignity slowly transformed into something optional, something you opted into rather than something assumed, and maybe that's worth sitting with for a moment. We live now in an era that prizes comfort above almost everything else. We see men board airplanes in sweatpants, walk into corporate boardrooms in hoodies, and honestly, nobody's arguing that's wrong. Comfort has its own kind of value, and nobody's suggesting we should all go back to wrestling with starched collars just to buy a gallon of milk. But there was something quietly beautiful about that old philosophy, the belief that stepping outside your front door was an event worth preparing for, that the neighbor you passed on the sidewalk deserved to see you at your best, that the world itself, in all its ordinary Tuesday glory, was still a place worth dressing up for. Somewhere between the fedora and the hoodie, we traded a little bit of that daily discipline for a little more ease. Whether that's progress or loss probably depends on who you ask. But it's hard not to feel a small pang of nostalgia for a time when getting dressed in the morning was itself a quiet act of respect, for yourself, and for everyone you'd meet along the way.